No one in Pine Ridge Valley expected the quiet cabin at the edge of the forest to become the center of the biggest HOA drama the community had ever seen. But on one sunny morning, a single phone call changed everything, and by the end of this story, the woman who made that call would realize she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The cabin had always been there, sitting peacefully beside a winding gravel road that curved through tall pine trees. It wasn't flashy or modern. It was simple, wooden, and surrounded by nature. Most people assumed it belonged to someone who valued privacy more than attention. That morning, Daniel Harper stood outside the cabin repairing a small wooden fence that had been damaged by last week's storm. He worked quietly, focused, enjoying the calm breeze that moved gently through the valley, but not everyone appreciated the cabin's presence. Across the road, a woman named Linda Carter watched from her SUV with a frown. Linda was the president of the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association, and she took her role very seriously. In her mind, rules existed for a reason, and every resident had to follow them. The problem was that the cabin didn't look like it followed any of them. The paint was slightly faded. The gravel driveway wasn't perfectly aligned with the HOA's landscaping guidelines. And worst of all, Linda believed the property had never been properly registered with the association. To her, that meant one thing: someone thought they were above the rules. Linda stepped out of her vehicle, pulled out her phone, and began dialing a number. Her voice was calm but firm. "Yes," she said when the call connected. "I'd like to report a property violation in Pine Ridge Valley." She glanced toward Daniel's cabin as she spoke. What Linda didn't know yet was that the quiet man fixing his fence wasn't just another resident. And within the next hour, everyone in Pine Ridge would learn a truth that would completely change the story. The police cruiser rolled slowly down the gravel road, its tires crunching softly against the stones. Daniel looked up from the fence when he heard it approaching, brushing sawdust from his hands. Across the road, Linda stood proudly with her arms crossed. She believed she had done exactly what a responsible HOA president should do. After all, rules were rules. When the officers stepped out of the cruiser, Linda immediately walked toward them, her confident smile returning. "Thank you for coming," she said. "There's a property here that doesn't follow HOA regulations. I've tried to handle it politely, but the owner refuses to cooperate." One of the officers nodded and glanced toward Daniel. "Sir," he called calmly. "Mind coming over for a moment?" Daniel walked toward them with relaxed steps. His expression was calm, almost curious, as if he already knew where the conversation was going. Linda pointed toward the cabin. "That structure violates at least 3 association rules," she said firmly. "Improper exterior maintenance, unauthorized construction, and failure to register with the HOA." The officer turned to Daniel. "Is this your property?" Daniel nodded politely. "Yes, it is." Linda waited, expecting him to look nervous or defensive, but instead, Daniel simply smiled. It wasn't an arrogant smile, it was the kind of smile someone gives when they already know the outcome of a conversation. The officer looked between them. "Sir," he said gently, "are you part of the Pine Ridge HOA?" Daniel paused for a moment, then he gave an answer that made Linda's confident expression freeze. "No," he said calmly. "I'm not." And what he said next would leave the officers completely silent. Linda blinked in disbelief. Not part of the HOA? That didn't make any sense. Pine Ridge Valley was a private community. Every home inside its boundaries had to be registered with the association. That rule had existed since the neighborhood was first built. Linda straightened her posture. "That's impossible," she said quickly. "Every property in this valley falls under HOA jurisdiction." Daniel tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words carefully. "I understand why you might think that," he replied calmly. The officers watched the exchange quietly. Linda pulled out a folder from her SUV and flipped through several documents. She pointed toward a printed map of the valley. "See this boundary line?" she said. "Everything inside this area belongs to Pine Ridge HOA." Daniel looked at the map, then he smiled again. "Interesting map," he said politely. Linda frowned. "What is that supposed to mean?" Daniel stepped toward the map and gently tapped a spot near the edge of the valley. "You see this section right here?" he asked. Linda nodded impatiently. "That's the Eastern Ridge area." Daniel looked back at the officers. "That area," he said calmly, "was never sold to the development company." Linda's confidence faded slightly. "What are you talking about?" Daniel reached into his truck and pulled out a small folder of his own. Inside were documents much older than the ones Linda carried. He opened them slowly and handed one to the nearest officer. The officer's eyebrows lifted slightly as he read the page. Linda leaned forward nervously. What does it say? The officer looked up. Well, he said carefully, it says this land was privately owned long before Pine Ridge Valley even existed. Linda's stomach tightened, because if that was true, everything she believed about that cabin might be completely wrong. The quiet road suddenly felt much more serious. The officer studied the document carefully while Daniel stood patiently beside him. The paper looked old but official, stamped with county records and dated decades earlier. Linda tried to keep her voice steady. That doesn't prove anything, she said quickly. Plenty of properties change ownership. Daniel nodded calmly. That's true. Then he handed the officer another page. This one showed a detailed land survey covering thousands of acres across Pine Ridge Valley. The officer looked from the paper to the surrounding hills. Sir, he asked slowly, are you saying this property existed before the HOA development? Daniel smiled. Yes. Linda shook her head in disbelief. That still doesn't explain the cabin. Daniel pointed toward the forested hills stretching far beyond the neighborhood. My grandfather built the original lodge here nearly 70 years ago, he explained. Long before the housing community was planned. Linda felt her confidence slipping. But Pine Ridge owns the valley now. Daniel gently shook his head. No, he said, the developers bought sections of land from my family decades ago. Linda stared at him. Sections? Daniel nodded toward the mountains surrounding them. The neighborhoods, he said, the streets, the parks. They were all built on land my family sold. The officer looked at the map again. Wait, he said quietly. Daniel folded his arms and looked across the valley. My family kept the eastern ridge, he continued. Linda's voice came out almost as a whisper. How much land is that? Daniel gave a calm answer that made the entire situation change instantly. Most of the valley. And suddenly Linda realized the story she thought she controlled was only beginning. The wind moved gently through the pine trees as silence settled over the road. Linda felt a strange heaviness in her chest. She had come here expecting to enforce rules. Instead, the entire situation was shifting beneath her feet. The officer studying the documents looked back toward the valley. Sir, he asked carefully, are you saying your family still owns the undeveloped land surrounding Pine Ridge? Daniel nodded. Yes. Linda shook her head slowly. That can't be right. The HOA manages the entire community. Daniel's voice remained calm. The HOA manages the neighborhood sections that were sold to the developers, he explained. He pointed toward the distant hills. But the forests, the ridge trails, the lakes. Those areas were never included in the sale. Linda felt her stomach drop, because those were the exact areas the HOA used in their marketing brochures: nature trails, private scenic overlooks, exclusive valley views, all features that helped increase property values. The officer lowered the document. Ma'am, he said gently to Linda, according to these records, Mr. Harper's family owns most of the land outside the residential blocks. Linda stared at Daniel. And the cabin? Daniel smiled slightly. The cabin sits on the original family property. That meant one simple thing: the HOA had absolutely no authority there. But the truth that followed was even more surprising, because Daniel wasn't angry about the mistake. He simply looked across the valley and said something that would leave everyone thinking. I've always tried to be a good neighbor, he said quietly, and Linda suddenly wondered how many years she had misunderstood the man living across the road. Linda stood quietly beside her SUV, the confidence she once carried slowly fading into reflection. For years, she had believed she knew everything about Pine Ridge Valley. She knew the rules, the regulations, the boundaries, or at least she thought she did. Daniel watched the valley peacefully, as if none of the tension mattered. The officer handed the documents back to him. Everything appears legitimate, he said respectfully. Linda finally spoke again. I didn't know, she admitted. Daniel nodded kindly. Most people don't. He looked toward the hills. My grandfather loved this valley, he explained. When developers approached him decades ago, he agreed to sell parts of the land so families could build homes here. Linda listened quietly. But he kept the forests, Daniel continued. He believed some places should stay exactly the way nature made them. Linda felt a mix of embarrassment and understanding. For years, the HOA had treated the valley like a carefully managed property, but the truth was much bigger. Daniel looked back toward her. I'm not against the HOA, he said calmly. I just live on the one piece of land that was never included. Linda nodded slowly. I see that now. But there was one final realization she hadn't considered yet, because when Daniel looked across the mountains surrounding the neighborhood, he said something that made the officers pause. "The truth is," he said quietly, "this valley still belongs to my family." And suddenly Linda understood the full weight of what had happened. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across Pine Ridge Valley as the conversation finally came to an end. What started as a simple HOA complaint had turned into something no one expected: a quiet cabin, a phone call, and a truth hidden in decades-old land records. Linda stood silently for a moment, looking across the valley she thought she knew so well: the forests, the hills, the winding trails, all the places the HOA proudly advertised as part of the community's beauty. They had always been there, but they had never belonged to the association. They belonged to Daniel's family. Daniel didn't seem proud or angry about the revelation, he simply smiled politely. "I've always enjoyed seeing families build homes here," he said. "That's why my grandfather sold the land in the first place." Linda nodded slowly. For the first time since arriving that morning, her voice was calm. "I guess I should have asked more questions before calling the police." Daniel chuckled softly. "That usually helps." The officers shared a quiet smile before returning to their cruiser. As the vehicle disappeared down the gravel road, the valley felt peaceful again. But Linda knew one thing for certain: the quiet man living in the small cabin wasn't breaking HOA rules. He owned the land the rules were built on, and that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. If you love the drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts. It really helps this channel grow.